ask if we can start the recording again. Thanks, Nathan. Okay, lovely. And I'm just checking the screen. I think we've got everybody back. Yes, perfect. Okay, right. Thanks, everybody. Hopefully you're all feeling refreshed and ready for item number 6 on the agenda. So this is a 6-monthly progress update against our annual delivery plan, and I shall hand over to David for this item, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, page 121 of the combined papers will give you the 6-monthly update of our annual delivery plan. A couple of caveats just to begin with. It's a 6-monthly update, and yes, we're in November, but the plan was formally submitted in June, and the status is reported as of the end of September. So it's limited in that sense of the timescales in which what was committed is measured and reported on. Secondly, as we report into our annual delivery plan, there's a relatively small number that has been committed to in those that opening quarter, if you like, because many of the commitments that we're making with government are done over the duration of the plan itself. And a lot of the discussion on these individual elements, particularly those of national importance, are monitored on an ongoing basis with various executive groups within Scottish Government, directly with the specialty areas, as I mentioned earlier, for example, around scheduled care or mental health performance and so on. So this is a bit of a snapshot with regard to where we are against those various elements. But what it does do is it correlates it back to our overall strategy, and that's where it is quite helpful to be able to see how they correlate with our different wells. This report has already gone through our Finance, Performance and Resource Committee. So it's pretty much the report that went through in that last cycle. And I think the chair of the committee mentioned that in his update. The other element of it, just to mention, there's about 75% of according to the pie chart, of those things that at that end of September date were either on track, complete, or in progress. Recognising those items in yellow, although they may be perhaps sometimes slower in starting, that they still are on schedule to deliver and will carry forward into the next periods. Also, just to mention that some of those items highlighted in red have already begun and made progress since the update of the report. Other items that are in there are also dependent upon Scottish Government guidance. So, for example, under Treatwell, the publication of the list of procedures of low clinical value, that is an item that's still waited from Scottish Government. So that obviously, as a board, we can't progress that until such times as that has been delivered from Scottish Government. So what I would say is formally for noting today in its current content. But obviously, as the year continues and the further reports are done, then this will be fleshed out. And we'll also reflect to make sure that the board can be as well informed in those as possible. Finally, the other thing that we'll look to try and do is where we talk about a number of items that required delivery, it doesn't necessarily tell you which are the ones that were relatively minor and which were the more major ones. So again, we'll have a reflection on that so that better assurance can be achieved from it. With that, I'll open up for questions. Just to make you aware, I'll take the easy questions, and Brian McKellar from the team will take all the difficult ones. But now Brian's been instrumental in being able to, with his team, monitor a lot of the progress around these with the individual teams across the organisation. So yeah, it's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I appreciate the work that Brian and the team do in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks, Brian, and thank you for being here. I suppose just before I go into questions, I really enjoyed reading this. It was I mean, I've got questions, but I'll allow others to come in first. But I just want to say it was such a helpful reminder of all the work, the kind of variety and the breadth and the complexity of the work that's going forwards. I have questions around those which are kind of at risk or delay, but it was great to see some of that detail as a reminder of what's going on behind the scenes that doesn't always necessarily come through in the other work that we look at. Okay, I'll open up for others to bring in their questions and I might come back to my own. Susan, I'll bring you in first, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, and thank you for that, David. And just picking up on that last point, that was going to be one of my questions. How are these prioritised? So I'm pleased to see that you are going to pick that up in further versions, and it is an interesting read. I mean, I was also particularly interested in the ones that are at risk or delayed. How are they connected? I mean, what impact might those delays have on other areas that are currently being delayed? The connectedness of it is something that perhaps could be drawn out in a bit of an overview. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. And I think that's one of the areas that we'll look to stratify to say, so what are the ones that are unique to a particular deliverable? And how much of a contribution is that? So that might be one of the criteria we look at. Secondly, what's the impact and the dependency that we might create in other areas? For example, some of the work around delayed discharges would have a very wide impact across the system. But other areas might be quite narrow and very specific to a specialty. And while that's an important element as far as that specialty is concerned, then it's pretty much bound by the specialty itself. I think there are other areas where, as we're working through with the Scottish Government teams, that becomes a very live discussion with them as opposed to something that was set at the time when the ADP was set. So sometimes government will refocus our attention and say, look, could you focus on this rather than that? And so therefore we'll deliberately reprioritize within those areas, which again, we don't change the ADP because the ADP was set at a point in time. But in some ways, there will be some items that become of lesser importance or reprioritized within the year. As I say, it's quite a complex thing to try and communicate simply, but we will have another go at it the next time around, and I'll welcome your feedback as to whether we've achieved it or not.
Thanks, David. Just before I bring Alex in, because it's off the back of the point that Susan made, just touching on the point you made about kind of refocus or shifting focus, as the world moves on and Scottish Government brings our attention to something in particular. I think it would be really good if that, I mean, I'm sure it will be being captured, but when we bring that back to the board in the future to take that whole year look back about how we delivered against the ADP, I think that would be a really helpful thing to kind of map in there. Because I guess we won't be privy to that information, so that'll be very helpful context for us. Okay, I'll bring Alex in next, please.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. David's kind of partially answered this. I must admit, I didn't notice this wording when we had the FRP, but on page 126, paragraph 3.1, KPIs on quality of care and waiting times continue to be developed in the ADP. Now, normally the KPIs are agreed at the start or up front and pushing it. I can understand a bit about the Scottish Government changing the focus. The implications of this is, does this mean that some KPIs they drop off, or is this just you're adding KPIs to the list that we've had at the start?
There's Brian going to come in. I think it's probably quite a specific one. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, so definitely within the development of our programs, that's really where we're looking to assess what the measures of success need to be. So there are a core set of measures that we're developing that you will see through the IPQR, but in terms of some of the program deliverables that are additional, performance measures that we want to capture, and obviously make sure they're intrinsically linked through the IPQR. So that's the bit of development that needs to come through some of these deliverables. And as we see the Q3 and Q4 deliverables, the ones that we're working on at the moment, that should all come together through the different strategic themes, the well areas. So that's the bit of development that we're doing. There are absolutely performance measures that you see through the IPQR that are intrinsically linked to these deliverables, but there are additional measures that we need to capture, and that's the linkages. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Brian. And Boyd, I'll bring you in, please.
Yeah, I suspect Brian's done most of the answer already succinctly, but the problem can be, Alex, that there are many indicators, almost too many, and you have to choose from them. So I stopped myself printing off the cancer quality performance indicators, or QPIs, recently, because when I wanted to look at them all, and when I went to do that on A3 sized paper, I was going to be printing off 100 double-sided pages. So the number of indicators is overwhelming, and sometimes the knack is, as Brian has said, to try and find the things that are the right ones to work on and to concentrate on. They're all counted, but there will be some where the concentration of effort on the right small number will reap much greater dividends than trying to do all of them, and that you never actually get through them all easily. So I think it's that sort of challenge, isn't it? And that's a crude example, but one that certainly brought it home to me, the challenge that Brian and others, me amongst them, are having with identifying the right things to concentrate on.
Thanks. And Alex, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, it was more a case of, and I understand that, Boyd, and appreciate how many there will be. But are we focusing on trying to identify proactive indicators rather than reactive indicators? Now, to me, that's more difficult to do. The proactive ones are much more difficult to get a handle on. But if you've got this massive swathe of indicators within there, then you can possibly focus more on the proactive ones rather than the reactive ones, I hope. Thanks.
Thanks, Alec. I think we had some other people who were coming in response. So I'll take Tim and then David.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to circle back on this to the comment that Anne made earlier on in the meeting about inequalities, and it just exemplifies the challenge of dealing with the indicators, because just as Boyd has commented around the large level of indicators available for cancer, each of those indicators could potentially then be subdivided and looked at for inequalities. So inequalities as clearly is something that I'm particularly interested in. As it happens, the annual report, which will be coming, probably health annual report coming to the January meeting, will be focusing on inequalities. So we'll hear more about that there. But I think the challenge is not either to cover everything or to give up, but it's to get the right indicators that cover that maybe are examples of what we're doing, to make sure that we are dealing with the services and our population in the right way. But we can't look at everything. So it's really important to look at inequalities, but we will need to look at the right areas, and also make sure we're doing it correctly, and probably need to look at some indicators in considerable depth, given that people who are poor tend to be sicker, as well as having less access to care. So the two things compound each other. So I just thought it adds to the complexity, but I thought it was maybe the right time to raise that, and then we'll return to that at future board and other meetings.
Thank you, Tim. That's really helpful. David, you put your hand down, so I assume Tim has picked up the point you were going to make. And I'll pull us back out of the data black hole that we may be sinking into. I've got some other questions from other members. I've got Jerry and then Karen, please.
Thank you, Sarah. And it's not a data question, but it's really just to. I think Tim's more or less said what I was going to say, and I think it ties in with what David was talking about, and is how we take this forward in the future, because we can't possibly look at everything, and it's how we identify what's important to us. And I think, as Susan has rightly identified, how do we link these individual things to actually give us that bigger picture? That's what seems key to me. There is no doubt that there is enough data to satisfy the biggest data geek in the world, but it's actually taken out of that how we get this overall system performance. But I think what's key to that is recognising, and as far as possible, concentrating on what we as a board are aiming to deliver. Absolutely recognise the external factors that may well change where we need to concentrate during the year. But I think this is the importance of actually getting that plan set at the beginning of the year and understanding what we as a board are trying to deliver and what is our aim and how will we measure our own success moving forward. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Jerry. And that's a great point. Okay, I've got Karen next, please.
Thank you, and apologies, my dogs may start barking. The cat's gone for a walk on the beach. It was a question or an observation really, and perhaps a clarification about when we are looking, and I really appreciate the pages and pages of outcome measures, having looked at them myself in the past. Is there a way that we also reflect the selection of the areas that we focus on based on the experience of the people who receive our services? Sometimes it's easy to get focused on the systems requirements for outcomes and indicators, or professionals sometimes what they want to see. But do we have a way to link back to people's experiences of our services, or even discuss the areas that we're focusing on with people experience? I don't know if we've got those kind of user forums that perhaps could be used to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Thanks.
I'm happy to. I think there's two things in terms of that, Karen, because I think it is a really helpful way to stay grounded in what we're doing, because there is a real danger we become very service oriented. Just a reminder in terms of how that the Together We Care strategy was developed in the first instance was very much in that wider engagement to ensure that right across all of the opportunities for engagement with patient groups, local groups, as well as trying to then decipher that into individual areas of delivery. So it wasn't necessarily the public who came up with the Wells themes, if I can describe it that way, but nonetheless the content of what is in them has been very much driven by what the feedback that we received as we collated it. But so I think that's always helpful. The other element I was going to mention earlier actually is that many of the most significant items that are within our ADP, it is the basis of which we form our IPQR. So those two areas are very much linked, and the highest profile and the most significant areas of delivery, and not always do they coincide, but very often they can, are contained within IPQRs, and actually that's what our governance committees would look at. Some of the subsidiary items that we would have, which Alex was alluding to earlier, are the ones that are contained within the services that would then deliver on those final outcomes. These are the ones that are more likely to move rather than the end outcomes, which are very specific and unlikely to move. Sometimes targets, the actual specific target number can change, and that's with agreement. But generally the theme does not. So, but I think in terms of relating this back to patient experience is a really important part, whether that's part of this ADP review or whether that's part of the IPQR and our overall performance metrics. Both of those things always require that level of cross-check with what actually is the experience of those who use our services and are looking for those outcomes and what their experience is how it reflects across those. So it's always an ongoing challenge, and that's the reason why we engage so widely on an ongoing basis. And I know the executive team, as well as our teams sitting underneath that, extensively engage with public to try and get that feedback on an informal basis as well as a formal basis. Sometimes it's difficult to reflect in this type of report as it comes across an ADP, but that tension always needs to be there.
Thanks, David. I've got one kind of observation, or I'm going to try and pull together a few things and then one question. So I think this flows beautifully from the conversation we just had at the end of the finance item, particularly when we think about, that recognition that we have finite capacity, finite resource. How do we assess where we need to focus our energies on? I think Susan's point was really well made about the impact, maybe not just particularly within one area, but across the system. So that's one thing we need to look at. I think Tim's point around inequalities, Karen, your point about what is it that our patients and communities would want us to focus on, not just what does the system look like it wants. I think that's really important. One thing that we haven't talked about, and I'm not suggesting we go into a deep conversation about it today, but I think something for us to consider as we go forward into thinking about how do we talk about our areas of focus and where we want to, target. So we haven't talked about impact assessments, and I'm picking that up following on a really interesting conversation that Karen and I had about equality impact assessments and how do we bring that in. So recognise that's trying to pull a lot of different strands into one thing, but I think that that's going to be really important for us to pull together. And I suppose pulling in yet another strand, thinking about our risk management framework, our risk appetite, and where that sits within that context as well. So not something we don't have time to talk about all of that or kind of try and find a solution to that today, but maybe something for us to take away and have a scratch about on a whiteboard and bring that back. One question I did have was, the paper mentions feedback received after Q1, I think it was. I'm interested to know if that, did that tell us anything helpful? What was the kind of the content of that feedback? But the other bit I wanted to ask was about our confidence level into the next bit of the year. So I think the report's really, really helpful in allowing me to understand which bits are on track, which bits are at risk, and going into further detail about why the ones that are at risk, and that's really, really helpful. But I suppose based on that, recognising the world may change, what are our current kind of confidence levels in that Q3, Q4 delivery, and where are we sitting with that? And Brian has very helpfully put his hand up, so I'll bring Brian in, please.
Thank you. I put my hand up on the first element of that around the Scottish Government feedback, which has been a general feedback to all boards just around the format of our returns. We haven't had anything specific around the progress and how assured government are that we are progressing, because of course that's for the board to monitor progress against the deliverables. But we do expect that there will be some communication that comes back from government now that the 6-monthly update has gone in. We're also planning for the next planning cycle, which we expect to receive the guidance from government imminently. So that's the kind of current feedback we've had from government around our plans and the progress of the ADP.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Thank you, Brian, for explaining that, which I suppose puts David on the spot to maybe pick up the second part of my question.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really helpful question, because we definitely will reflect on, as I say, how better we can present this information to you. It serves a purpose as it sits at the moment, but I think we can reflect to see if we're able to give that better insight, that forward look that you're describing. I suppose the other reflection I've had just as we tried to do that, and it's been quite a tricky exercise to be honest, is also in how we set our ADP targets, so that we can set them up so that recognise them, that we want to be able to measure the performance against them. So sometimes it's how we articulate the targets that gives you the structure to help you report. So yes, we'll do a bit of reflection on that and certainly feed that into our forward planning process as we approach next year. Would you believe? So we're having our 6 monthly report in the current year, but we're already talking about planning next year. That's just the way it goes.
Yeah, that never stops rolling. Yeah, and I recognise, to pick up your point earlier, David, about everything, all the stuff that we're talking about, is, I suppose, in our IPQR as well. And to a certain extent, that forward look is demonstrated through the trajectories that we pull through in our IPQR. So, not wishing to create more work, we don't want to make an industry of talking about the ADP. So there's maybe just something about when it's time to bring the ADP back, maybe just something about how we pull through from the IPQR, but really interesting. I thought it was a really, really helpful paper. Actually, I enjoyed reading it immensely. So that's great. Thank you. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands up. So as you shall just recap, we are being asked to note the content of the report and take moderate assurance. Are members content with that? Great, thumbs up, brilliant. And thank you, Brian, for stepping in and taking those specific questions for us. Okay, item number 7. This is our Highland Child Poverty Action Plan covering 2023 to 24. And we have Tim to introduce the paper, and I think, do we have Linda with us to talk through the detail? But I'll hand over to you, Tim.
Yes, I'm afraid Linda, because we're running a little bit early, Linda was occupied this morning, so wasn't able to come until just about the scheduled time, if at all. So sadly, she's not able to come. Kathy Steer has just joined us, so Kathy will be able to answer some of the questions. If there are detailed questions, Kathy will be in a much better position than I would be to answer some of the detailed questions. So I'll present the paper. And then I would take questions if you're happy with that, Chair.
Yeah, if that's okay with yourself and Kathy. The other alternative is I rejig the agenda and take this item a little later to allow Linda to join.
I think we should be. I think we should be okay.
Let's give it a crack then. On you go.
Okay. So the background to this is the 2017 Child Poverty Scotland Act, which introduced duties on both the Scottish Government and on local authorities and health boards to report, to address child poverty and also to report on progress on child poverty. The reports are done at a local authority or partnership base level. So we would have 2 reports, one for Argyll and Bute and one for Highland. The Argyll and Bute report for 23-24 is already been to the integration joint board. The Highland report has been more delayed. So there was a Highland report that came to the board for the previous year, came earlier on in this year in May, and we're really catching up due to issues around I think things like the legacy of COVID and other issues causing delays. So we're really catching up to get on schedule with this report to report back on what's happened in 23-24 and what plans there are for the future in the Highland Council area. When we come to the next report that will cover the current year, then we'll get a paper coming to this board which will include both the Argyll and Bute and the Highland reports, and we'll be back fully on schedule. It's worthy of noting though that these are reports for approval, and the report's already been to Highland Council, but we are asked to approve that for submission for submission to Scottish Government. It's also worth noting as a background in general child poverty that we often talk about child poverty. The First Minister has said that child poverty is his #1 priority for his work in the current administration, but child poverty goes far beyond that and really is about poverty in the community and family poverty, and don't get child poverty without family poverty. Although the deprivation and reduction in life chances for children, of course, goes beyond the issues of family poverty, but it's really something that we need to be particularly concerned about. The start of the report has a lot of epidemiological information and comparisons about levels of child poverty compared with the rest of Scotland, and that members will see that our child poverty levels are generally in line with the levels for Scotland as a whole, but and go up and down along with Scotland as a whole, tend to be a little bit lower, but not a whole lot lower. And we also need to look at the large percentage of children who are growing up in income deprived families, and also the trend following a drop in the COVID, some reduction in COVID years owing to some additional funding coming in for families. The level of child poverty has increased. So there is a lot that we still need to do about that. While of course within Highland the lead agency model means that a lot of child health services are provided by the council. We still are responsible for a very wide range of children's services, and we have we're responsible for we have the accountability for all the services, of course, and delegate that to the council. But we have a large range of services for children at Raigmore, with paediatrics, with CAMS, with NDAS, and of course the young people's main contact with health services will be with primary care. So the lead agency is a little bit of a red herring, because we still have a vast responsibility for children and for children's services. And we also have, as is mentioned in the paper, our corporate responsibility as sort of good corporate citizens, and that's why the child poverty work links into the work that's being undertaken on NHS Highland and Highland Council as anchor institutions and as principal employers. So this links up with recruitment, retention, how we support people in local communities as an employer, how we support local people in communities through our procurement work. A lot of the actions that are set out as what has been done in the year 23-24 are more specific, things like welfare benefits support, but what we need to work further this year and in future years is a more general support, and be able to link up what we do corporately to help tackle childhood and overall family and community poverty. And of course we have some special issues given the geography that we have, and it's noted within the paper around the number of children in both Highland and in Argyll and Bute who live in more isolated and rural and island areas, and this of course links back to in general terms to the comments that have been made about inequalities. And the more that we can address the poverty and the inequalities issues with young people, the better life chances that people will have and the better health they'll have through the life course. That really sets out the paper. Don't know whether Kathy may want to come in with some specific comments, so I'll leave it, but other than that, we'd open for questions.
Thanks, Tim. Oh, sorry, my screen's just gone a bit funny and I can't get it back to normal. So hang on just a second. I'll see if I can make Teams do what I want it to do. Okay, I temporarily can't see hands up, so if anybody else can, hang on. Oh, there we go. Sorry, back to normal now. Great, thank you, Tim. I don't know, did Kathy, did you want to come in with anything specific before I open up for questions and comments?
Thanks, Chair. I think Tim summarised the report pretty well. Maybe just to add that for in Highland, in terms of how this activity is monitored and reported more regularly, it's through the Integrated Children's Service Planning Board, which also reports into the Highland Community Planning Partnership. So it comes to the NHS Board and Highland Council on an annual basis, but there is a bit more regular reporting to the Integrated Children's Service Board.
Okay, now that's helpful. Thank you, Kathy. Okay, members, opening up for questions, comments, observations. Jerry.
Thank you, Sarah. And really, just first of all, just to thank Tim and his team for the report. It's one of these reports, and it's very good that it's here with us today, and we're talking about it today. But it's also very sad that actually, as we're about to enter 2025, that we're sitting having discussions about levels of child poverty. But I actually take on one of my comments was going to be taking on board Tim's point exactly. Child poverty is a subset of family and community poverty, and I suppose one of my questions would be is how do we get that overview of the whole community poverty action and how they're all pulling together and how they actually are addressing all the issues together. And I had a very specific question about the definition of poverty and it being less than 60% of the median income. And we'll ignore the fact that therefore anybody in 61% is not in poverty. But actually, how do we reflect then the purchasing power of that? And that's bringing into that cost of living, that remote and rural, where actually having more than one car in the house is probably not a luxury, it's a necessity because etc. And all the remote and rural issues, which we're very much aware of, and the general cost of living in a remote and rural area, which I know is reflected in the report. I think really can anywhere between 10 and 33%, and it's probably neither 40 or 50% more expensive than living, say, in mainland or the central belt. But I suppose so those few observations. But I'd be really interested to hear about how we actually coordinate the whole poverty agenda, Tim, and make sure we're addressing it as a whole and not as individual elements within that agenda. Thank you.
Yes, I mean that's in a way that's it links back to some of the issues that we've considered earlier around inequalities, and it's such a big area. I mean, one answer would be to see the actions that we're doing in the individual actions that we're doing in a wider context. And to some extent, we've done that with the social mitigation work, and that's come to the board certainly in the context of COVID and what's happened after COVID. I think there are two more practical answers, perhaps, rather than to be overwhelmed by it. One is to focus on the board's work as an anchor institution and to think what we can do in terms of employment, in terms of wage, in terms of helping people who are in the more isolated communities where NHS Highland may well have a presence there'll be some communities where there are very few public sector presence. I was at the Inverness Fast headquarters yesterday, and I was just discussing with the chief fire officer about that there are some communities where it might just be NHS Highland and a retained fire station and maybe a small shop or something like that. So we've got the opportunity in the anchors work and to look at local procurement and things like that. But separately, I think inequalities has been mentioned, and as I said earlier, it's a huge area when we look at indicators. But I think there's the opportunity to look at inequalities in a broad context, and not just to think of, well, we've got these people who live in this particular area, who are allocated a particular level of deprivation by where they live, and that they have got a longer wait than somebody else. Now, that on its own is worth taking action on, but if we focus on what we do in the context of wider inequalities, looking at access, looking at rural access, looking at income, looking at opportunities, while we look at one particular area, and it gets back to the impact assessments. So it's how we use tools like that to look at poverty. I think if we decided, well, we want to look at poverty as a whole, we'd just be overwhelmed with the challenges that we've got to face. What the social mitigation strategy did was to come up with a list of actions and deliverables which have been put in place, and that's one approach. But I think the other one would be to say, well, we look at impact assessments. So what is the impact on poorer people of what we do in a particular area? So as we look at how we're doing future strategies for the board, we can take an inequalities lens to that. But I think that needs then to be quite a wide one. So I hope that's sort of a framework for an answer. And I'm delighted to see that Linda has been able to join us earlier than expected. So I know she's got her hand up.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Linda. It's lovely to see you. So I'll bring you in now.
Thank you. It was just Jerry, to come up with two examples which I think help as well. So one of the things is we're currently working with our staff in the employment section in People and Culture to talk about how we might develop the employment strategy and to ensure that includes vulnerable groups. Now, that would be children and families, but it would be wider than that too. So employment is one big thing. I think we're a major employer across the area. We talk about fair work, consistent work. In the NHS, we can provide that. So that's one example. The second one is our income maximisation work, where we run the money counts courses and the iFan leaflet. That again isn't specifically targeted around children and families. So that will include lots of different services working with lots of different people. So these are really good examples, I think, about how we're actually expanding. This is not just about child poverty. This is actually poverty experienced by lots of people. Some of the actions we've tailored into the child poverty plan, but actually they have wider applicability across our population. So hopefully that's two examples to give.
Those are really helpful. Thank you, Linda. Gareth, were you coming in on the back of Linda? Yep.
Yeah, it's just a note that we've progressed with in partnership, as Linda was highlighting there, around developing an employability strategy. So that's been that's in its sort of first draft going through the group at the moment, and we'll progress and bring that through the relevant governance processes. But again, focuses on a wider range of employment opportunities, including, for example, long-term unemployed and so on. So referencing Linda's points there. So you'll see that in due course.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Thank you. And I've got Alistair next, please.
Yes, thank you. This is a very interesting conversation that we're having about poverty, and I think the point's been made that child poverty will only be addressed if you address the family's poverty and the whole underlying reasons as to why there's poverty. I think the real issue is that I think, we've been discussing poverty for a long time saying it shouldn't happen in the 21st century, but we're now at 2024, so we're coming up to a quarter of the way through the century. And the reason that it's not being addressed fully is that there's not enough collaborative working between the statutory agencies and the third sector and the voluntary sector to address this. There's still a little bit of siloing going on here, and I think that goes back to the comment made about anchor agencies. I think anchor agencies need to realise that there's other people in the third sector and the voluntary sector that could perhaps add more value more quickly at the grassroots level and be more respected and accepted by the people that are trying to help. For instance, I believe that there's a project to get GPs to refer to an income maximisation team, and I think in one of the appendices it says there's 29 referrals been made. Well, that's a bit of a disaster. Really, when you think of the amount of time that's gone into that, I think it says it's a slow burner to start, but I think that shows that it's probably in the wrong place. If you'd gone and stood outside Merkinch Primary School or another cool primary school or whichever primary school, I think you've had more engagements and more referrals. So I think it's about finding the right way to engage in a manner that the beneficiary group wants to engage. And I think it's not just NHS Highland or the Highland Council or the Scottish Government or the UK Government. I think there's a lot more needs to be happening with pace and urgency on this issue to address it. And I think maybe if people can think about maybe having a summit and getting everybody from the third sector and the major players like I suppose you can't notice, but like Citizens Advice, who've not been engaged and consulted, particularly on the child poverty programme or any other poverty programmes, like Christians Against Poverty, who do valuable work in money advice, and many other organisations that do housing support. So I think it's really a question of a radical review at this and trying to break the cycle by doing something different and actually getting closer to the people. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Thank you, Alistair. No, I think it's you've made a really important point, and particularly recognise that point around how and where we're engaging, how we take it to the people rather than waiting for the people to come to us. But I can see that Linda's got her hand up to come back on those points. I'll bring you in, Linda.
If that's okay, and I don't disagree, Alistair, at all, but just to say that in the Reducing Poverty Group, which is the thematic group sitting under Highland Community Planning Partnership, we've got representation from HIPAN, which is the Highland Poverty Against Network. I can't even think what it stands for now, and that's third sector groups. So we've started to set up steering groups, which will include representation from each of the voluntary sector groups that have an interest in that. And I think you're right, we need to include CAB, we need to include Christians Against Poverty, we need to include other groups in that. But we're beginning to set that up so that there are steering groups with that expertise sitting in it, because you're absolutely right. Third sector are part of the solution for some of this, and we need to capture that.
Okay, that's good to hear that, Linda. And of course, we've got strong links with the TSI as well, and bringing that in. And I'm also thinking just about the other tables that we sit around, within the community planning partnership and other areas where we sit, where of course this is on that agenda as much as it is on ours. And I think your challenge is a good one, Alistair, about driving this forward much more firmly. So I hope we can all take that away into our various forums and groups that we engage with on a daily basis, and push that forwards in whatever way that we can. Okay, that was a really helpful discussion. I'm not seeing any other hands up. Just to echo the points made at the beginning, thank you to obviously Tim, Linda, and all the teams that have pulled this together. It's a really rich report. It's a really important report. Recognise that a huge amount of work goes into producing something of this quality, so a big thank you. And of course for all the work that's going on that you're reporting on, that's the important stuff, so a big thank you to everybody who's doing the work. We are being asked to approve the Highland Child Poverty Action Plan, and the proposed level of assurance today is moderate. And for information, there is also the link you should be able to see where it takes you to the Argyll and Bute Child poverty action plan, which Tim talked about at the beginning as well. Are members content with that? Yep. Okay. Lovely. Thank you very much. We are ahead of the kind of the planned timings on the agenda. So what I'm going to suggest is that we carry on, because we're not long back from a tea break. So I think we carry on. We can take our 2 performance reports from both of our partnerships and then take a lunch break after that, if everybody's okay with that. Okay, so this takes us to item 8. So we have our annual performance reports from both the Highland Health and Social Care Partnership and our Argyll and Bute Health and Social Care Partnership. So this is items 8A and 8B in your pack. So first up, we have the Highland Health and Social Care Partnership, and I would like to invite Pam to speak to this item, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm really pleased to bring the annual performance report for the Highland Health and Social Care Partnership area that we have taken to the Health and Social Care Committee and also approved by the Joint Monitoring Committee in terms of our lead agency governance processes. Helpfully, the plan outlines an executive summary at the start of the document, and that was an improvement that we made following the approval at the Joint Monitoring Committee, just to be able to summarise our strong performance in the areas where we've had good quality of service. So, for example, high levels of care coordination of 84.8% in our care services, for example, graded as good or better through care inspectorate inspections, so internal inspections. So that's really positive. Although we have our challenges of people in delay and increasing costs of care and increasing demand, this offers us a very balanced report to show our delivery and our performance against the national health and wellbeing targets and across our integrated children's services as well. So the integrated children's services plan was launched in August 2023, and we've also reflected where we've published our joint strategic plan at the end of 2024, which is a 3-year plan. So this document underpins our progress in many areas across the integrated children's services, adult social care, care homes and care at homes, primary care, mental health and learning disability services, and integrated services across our community services. So I'm happy to take questions or comment on the annual performance report from the board today. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. And obviously it's a very large report. There's a huge amount in that. And as you referenced, Pam, it has been through other governance structures for discussion, which is good. But I'm happy to open up for questions, comments. There's obviously a lot in there. Emily, I'll take you, please.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you, Pam. Just in the context of some of the discussions we've been having about assurance levels and exactly what is being assured on, can I just clarify what you're giving substantial assurance on? Is it just that we've met the reporting requirement, or is it something slightly different? Thank you.
So annually we meet the reporting requirement, which is set out in the integration legislation, to provide an annual performance report, and the assurances around the the report itself in terms of how it's been structured and what assurance it's provided to the Health and Social Care Committee and to the Joint Monitoring Committee in terms of our integration arrangements.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Pam. And that's a good point, Emily. And that was something that we covered in our development session, wasn't it? Is that we need to be clear about what it is that we're offering assurance on, whether it's a plan or performance or outcomes. So that's helpful clarification. Thank you very much. Okay, any other questions on the annual performance report? Just checking my notes. Can it's not necessarily something through the performance report, but it was a question that I had that the performance report kind of stimulated in my mind. And it was really around the work around the promise. Now, this might be something that we need to go away and bring back, but it was just something that I was mindful of. I know that there is the promise board, and I'll probably get this wrong, obviously reporting into the other structures around children's services. But I wonder if I can just get somebody can refresh my memory around those kind of reporting structures. And I'm really mindful that, you know, yes, we have specific integration arrangements where we, you know, responsibility or for delivery of services is delegated within that arrangement, but clearly it's everybody's business to kind of be committed to delivering the promise. So I just wondered if I could get a reminder around the governance against the promise for us.
So as I understand it, the Integrated Children's Services Plan was launched in August 2023, which I made reference to at the start of presenting my approach. So they've got a number of delivery groups that look at the priorities and deliver against them, and that's all reported through the Integrated Children's Services Planning Board. And we do receive some reports and assurance through the Highland Health and Social Care Committee through that board, and obviously ultimately to the Joint Monitoring Committee. Does that answer your question, Chair?
Yes, and I think this is maybe something that we need to take offline, and it's maybe that it's been addressed and I just can't remember all the various agendas for all the various meetings, but I suppose I'm keen that we are satisfied as a board around the governance arrangements, and I'm picking on the promise particularly just because I read something in your report that triggered my memory, so that's helpful, thank you. And I'm happy that we can take that offline and just look at that, and it's maybe that I just need to understand the mapping of that a little bit better. But I think, you know, that is, I suppose, one of the slight challenges with our unique integration arrangements is that it doesn't all just kind of go into one pot, it goes into different places, and sometimes I think that means that it isn't as clear to us where the assurance and scrutiny sits. It's not that it's not there, it is, but it's just making sure that that is clear to us and it's mapped out. And as I said, the promise was just one that kind of popped out at me as I was reading the report. Okay, any other questions or comments for the annual report for the Highland Health and Social Care Partnership? No, okay, I'm not seeing any other hands up. So for this report, we are being asked to take assurance and note the report as agreed by the Highland Health and Social Care Committee and the JMC in September. And that then takes us on to the second half of this. So this is the report for the Argyll and Bute Health and Social Care Partnership. And I would like to invite Evan to speak to this, please.
Chair, I think Evan's on hold. I'll try and call him in to the meeting.
Yes, he maybe have to take another call.
Try and call him in.
To be fair, we are fairly ahead of schedule, so he maybe thought that he had a minute.
I'll call him in now. But I can't call him because he's in the meeting and he's on hold. I'll have to send him a
Okay.
message, Chair. Apologies. I'll get in touch with him.
No worries. Thanks, Pam.
I've just spoken to Evan, so he's all right.
Oh, okay.
He's just
Poor Evan.
next door.
Poor Evan. We're all trying to get a hold of him all at once. He probably feels like he's been bombarded, right? We'll just give him a second. Okay. I do apologise, Evan. We're ahead of schedule, but we are at your item. So I realise that we might have just kind of dragged you in slightly unexpectedly there because we are a fair bit ahead of schedule. But we are on item 8B. So this is the annual performance report for the Health and Social Care Partnership. So sorry, we've just kind of sprung that on you a little bit out of the time sequence as planned, but hopefully I can bring you in to speak to that item now.
That is okay, Chair, and congratulations for being ahead of schedule. And yeah, what you're seeing is partnership working in action that I'm split across our council partners and our the HSCP's board partners today. So I'm delighted to present the annual performance report. I suspect Pam has given you an introduction to the North Highland one, but this is a statutory requirement for us as a public body. We need to report annually on our performance, and this report goes to our IJB as well as to both of our partner organisations and all of our area committees across Argyll and Bute to make sure that we're properly communicating our performance out to the communities that we work in partnership with. This report covers our performance against a number of key indicators, and it covers our financial performance as well as our engagement approach. We also, recognising that another of our statutory obligations is to produce a joint strategic plan, use this performance report as an opportunity to update on progress against that plan at the year 2 position. The one slight disadvantage of this report is it's not especially up-to-date information. Remember, this is a 23 to 24 report, so it's very much a backwards looking report. And I recognise that most of what we're discussing through this board is very kind of current and forward looking. To touch briefly on some of the detail. This is the first full year of reporting using our new integrated performance management framework, which is a process within the partnership for setting and reporting against a number of key indicators across each head of service area, and using the Clinical Care and Governance Committee as a governance group before reporting to the IJB. Some key successes would be around the increased number of children, looked after children placed near their home, which is obviously really, really important and a real challenge for us as a rural area. Increased number of telecare users with the digital device, an increase in the number of near me consultations very slightly. And our A&E attendances, while not at the 95% target nationally, they're just slightly below that target. In terms of challenges, we've shown continuing challenges around recruitment and retention of staff across the Health and Social Care Partnership. Our performance targets for delayed discharges and bed days are not where we'd want them to be. And that is a challenge that continues right up to the present. And that's an area of focus through the national mission, and our delayed discharges bring us up to the present, sit just around the Scottish average, which is still too many people who are not in a place of their choosing when they could or should be. And also people still waiting longer than they should for AHP outpatient referrals. So there's some targeted work ongoing around those AHP lists. In terms of financial performance, the performance report shows that we finished 2023-2024 with a surplus, largely related to staffing vacancies, use of reserves, and also an 83% delivery on our savings target. Looking, I guess, bringing it up to the present, we're obviously moving into a much more challenging financial position for this year. It also gives assurance around our engagement process. and the structure that we have within the Health and Social Care Partnership around that. That's driven by an engagement reference group that we have that makes sure we're aligned with the engagement requirements we have through Healthcare Improvement Scotland and the Planning with People guidance, but also through our council partners. And finally, as I mentioned, there's a year 2 update that covers each of our delegated service areas for under the Joint Strategic Plan, and a summary of the actions in progress to date around that, noting that the iteration of our Joint Strategic Plan will come to an end in March 2025, and work is underway to prepare a new one. I'll stop there and happy to take any questions on the Argyll and Bute performance report.
Thank you, Evan. That's really helpful. And again, thank you to yourself and all your teams who put the work into this. It's a great report. I actually found this really digestible. This is a huge, lots and lots in here. But I think the team have done a really good job at kind of structuring that in a way that makes it easy to get through. And at the risk of kind of oversimplifying a very complex system, even those successes and challenges at the very start of the report, I think is a good, it helps you kind of focus your mind before you get into the nitty-gritty of it. So I really like that. And I suppose it's great to see every year we bring this back in slightly different iterations, and it's great to see that evolving. And similar to the Highland report, I think it does a great job of showing areas where there's been, as you said, really important success and development and improvement, but equally the areas of the system which remain under pressure. So it's helpful to kind of see that in the round. I'm happy to open up. Do members have any questions or comments or observations? And obviously this goes through the IJB as well. So it goes through lots of different places.
Yeah, in common with most of our governance chairs, this has now been to the IJB in advance of it coming to this board.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, so the poor IJB members have to sit, well, maybe not. Maybe they get the delight of going through it more than once.
Absolutely, something new to read every time.
That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions or comments from anybody. So similar to the previous item, we are being asked to take assurance and note the annual performance report as agreed by the IJB in September. Are members happy with that? Great. Okay, so I'm going to contradict myself. I said we were going to take lunch next, but actually I'm feeling bold and ambitious. We're going to plough on because we've got a couple of substantive items left, but there's not lots. So I am going to say that we just horse on and perhaps give you some of your afternoon back if people are okay with that. Right, okay, so item number 9, we have our corporate risk register, and I'd like to invite Boyd to speak to this item, please.
Thank you, Chair. So fast, I had to scrabble for my mute on-off button. Okay,
keeping on your toes today, Boyd, and keeping everybody fresh and awake, yeah.
Okay, so the board is asked to review or accept the report, our regular risk register paper, which is an updated version of our corporate or board level risks. The paper is to provide assurance to the board that we are mapping out our risks, that they are linked into our governance committees in NHS Highland, and that there is full oversight at both committee and board level. Committees include staff governance, audit committee, FRP, and clinical governance committees. And the risk register is an extract from the information that we house on Datix, which is our system for recording it. So the the section 2.3 in the paper gives updates of the risks since the last time, and the changes that have happened at or after the last board meeting were as follows. Risk 715 was moved from the board risk register to the Public Health Directorate risk register, and that was the impact of COVID on health outcomes. The fire compartmentation risk was pending approval from the Health and Safety Committee to be removed from the board risk register, but is left in this report because we want to comply with the risk de-escalation governance processes, but in effect that work is underway, and that's why that risk is reduced. And the next risk change that we have is risk 1279, the financial risk for adult social care, and an amendment to that in executive leadership has been made from the Director of Finance to the Chief Officer of the Highland HSCP. So that's the modification to that risk. The rest of the paper, I hope, speaks for itself, and I think that ends my introduction of the paper, and open it to you, Chair, and to any colleagues who wish to ask any questions.
Thanks, Boyd. So happy to open it up. I wonder if we can, and I might invite colleagues that commented earlier and link us back into the conversation we had nearer the start of the meeting around I think, Anne, you made the point around the risk around the adult social care, and if that needs a bit of a review. And Steve, apologies, I can't remember exactly what your question or comment was, but there was something in there around making some adjustment to the risk in light of where we are now. So I don't know if we can pick that up. I realise we talked about it under the finance area, but I wonder if we can pick that up now as well. I don't know, Anne, Steve, if you wanted to kind of come in and reframe that now that we're at the risk section. Steve, I'll bring you in, please.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think my observation was that the risk in its current format potentially needs a review, given the conversation that we had earlier, and I think we did discuss earlier, maybe the need for a management plan, but one that's centered around that transformation that I think most of the board commented on, saying that we probably need a little bit more detail to take to the board. But I think that would underpin a management plan for this particular risk, and potentially looking at other risks, maybe a rescoring of the risk as well. I'm not sure what process there is in place to do that, but that's what I guess I was commenting on earlier. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for refreshing my memory, Steve. That's really, really helpful. I'll go through and take some others, and then we can kind of come back. Sorry, Gareth, you had your hand up. I'll bring you in.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up, and Richard will probably want to come in on this one, obviously both on the Health and Safety Committee. I think just noting it's something that gets discussed at Health and Safety Committee, but just in terms of nuance, this is a board risk, so it's for the board to decide whether it wishes to de-escalate it and hand it sort of, I suppose, back down to the Health and Safety Committee in relation to fire compartmentalisation. Probably touches on the point Steve's saying in terms of processes for within board meetings to make decisions in relation to the risk ratings and whether we then de-escalate them.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Gareth. I will take Emily next, followed by Jerry. Emily, sorry, you're on mute. And while I was trying to tell you that you're on mute, I was on mute. I know, we're all on mute.
It's all going really well. Sorry, I'll start again. I've got one procedural question or definition point and one about sort of the substance of the report, if that's okay. I just wanted to clarify if removal from the board risk register, did that mean it essentially becomes part of BAU and isn't reported on unless there's an incident? Or does it mean the risk is still captured somewhere? It's just that somebody else is responsible for managing it and the board doesn't need to see periodic updates on it. That was my first question. The second one was around just the narrative on the risk report. I feel like in some cases it's missing information on the impact, particularly in the finance risk. It says there's a risk that we won't achieve our forecast position, which I think we all know. And in some cases, arguably, we also instinctively know the impact of that, but it just might be helpful, particularly when we're looking at scoring, to consider what are the consequences of the outcomes that we're describing. Thank you.
Thanks. I don't know, before I bring Jerry and Boyd, did you want to pick up that question from Emily?
Yeah, so where risks are in the risk register at board level, they'll usually be strategic and or linked to a high value, usually strategic item. Where they, if they are taken out of that register, the risks still apply. There'll always be all sorts of fire risks that sit at the various levels. You've got level 2 and 3, for instance, risk registers. And they will sit there because risk is about all the things that might happen that you need to put in place measures and mitigations to deal with them. In the case of the firework, the mitigation work has commenced and will, through a programme of work, deliver. So it's now almost an operational situation, but we'll have to follow due process to take it into the right part of the operational section of the organisation. However, there will always be fire risks, and there will be risks related to that in all sorts of other risk registers in all sorts of parts of the organisation. This one was a particularly high tariff one, which made its way into our highest level risk register for good reason, but the large programme of work does address that. It's a very strong control or mitigation, which will achieve greater results with time.
Thank you, Boyd.
On the impact, take note. I think that's something that we'll try to work into future papers. Thanks.
Thanks, Boyd. And I've got some thoughts about what we might want to do in the future, but I'll bring Jerry in next, and then we can sum up. Jerry.
Thank you, Sarah. And I will 100% defer to Boyd on the de-escalation process, because I'm knowledgeless on that. It was really just on the wording of that box round about risk 712 and fire compartmentation. The actual discussion we had was an agreement to de-escalate it, but it was making sure that the chief fire officer was happy with their plan. That's not reflected in the narrative there. And the narrative certainly shouldn't be pending approval by the Health and Safety Committee. Because the discussion we had, and that's what's reflected in the minutes of the last board meeting as well, that actually it was pending approval of Richard's further discussion with the chief fire officer, now that a funding package and an overall fire plan had been developed. Apologies, I feel like a bit of a pedant saying that, but I think it's quite important if we're actually documenting why we're de-escalating a risk.
Yep, no, I think that's really important. And Richard has, right on cue, popped his hand up. So Richard is going to come in on the back of that query.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. Yeah, it's just a wording error. So we had that escalation meeting, Fiona and I met with the Highlands and Islands Watch Commander. We worked our way through the process. We got really good feedback. We also spoke about the processes we've put in place. We've got a fire safety group, and one of the things we do, and maybe this comes back to Emily's point, so I'll own this risk going forward. It'll be a directed level, but the fire safety group will observe the risk, and they'll be the team that will escalate or make recommendations if they feel that it's not been managed properly through the various processes we have in place. But yeah, just to answer your point directly, we did have that meeting, and it's maybe just not been reflected in the wording. And we've been given that assurance that both Highland Council Building Control and Scottish Fire and Rescue Service are happy with their plans.
That's helpful clarification. Thank you, Richard. Okay, so I think there's been some helpful conversation, I suppose, just to pick up a few things. And Boyd, you picked up some stuff that we can take into kind of future presentation, following on from Emily's points. I'm also just mindful while I was listening to the conversation that we had and I can't remember when it was, but we had that really good session in a development space where as a board we considered our risk appetite. And I know we've talked about you know, what we do with that going forward. I'm also mindful that we have members of the board who joined us after that session took place. And indeed, we will have more new board members coming in the new year. So perhaps, Boyd, something for us to take offline is to consider some future workshop development time when we have our new board members in, and we might use that as an opportunity both to refresh the conversation around risk appetite and how we use it, but also kind of around some of the stuff that we've talked about today. So I think that's quite a good opportunity for us coming up in the new year, if people are comfortable with that. Great. Okay. Lovely. So just to recap, because I'm not seeing any other hands up, we are being asked to take substantial assurance on our compliance with legislation and policy and board objectives with regards to our risk register. Are members content with that? Lovely. Great. Okay. That takes us on then to item number 10. So this is our whistleblowing report for quarter 2. And I'm going to invite Gareth to speak to this item, please.
Thank you, Chair. Background set out in terms of the context for the whistleblowing report. So we have a regular requirement to report to the board on activity in each quarter. This is for the period from 1st July to 30th September. This has progressed through our Staff Governance Committee and the APF as well, and gives you an update on the activity during that period. There's been no new cases raised during that period. One case remains open and under investigation, but subsequently, since we discussed that at the Staff Governance Committee, where there were some concerns raised around the length of time that one had been open, that is now closed, so I'm pleased that that has been closed. And we have one ongoing concern. I think just important to keep that highlighted, that it's an ongoing conversation with an individual in relation to a number of circumstances that are quite challenging for the service that they work within, and we're supporting them in the spirit of the standards in terms of keeping that in early resolution, but maintain the lines of communication with that individual, not closing off the options potentially for whistleblowing. But again, we're just actively managing that case at the moment. 3 cases were closed, and the rest of the detail is in the paper there. What we have done for this paper is, following some discussions earlier in the year, we were aware that we were not necessarily providing a lot of information in relation to the specifics of the cases. Now, take into consideration that the standards do require us to keep this as a confidential process, both in terms of location and members of staff that might be involved. There are some challenges in relation to what we can put into the public domain. So we have added a summary table, which we have anonymized as far as possible to articulate the concern, the nature of the concern, and then to articulate the actions and recommendations coming out from those, particularly. So these are where the whistleblowing concerns will have either, in the majority of cases, will have had something that's upheld, but that's not necessarily saying we won't get recommendations for cases where they're not upheld. But predominantly, these are recommendations coming out from the investigations that have been undertaken, and the actions we're then taking forwards to progress those pieces of work. We've also recognised that the nature of the concerns, which we obviously, members of the board will be aware from the annual review, predominantly sit in the quality and patient safety domain. We are looking at recommending which governance work stream, stream this should actually sit under predominantly, and that's why there's a governance arrangement column within the report indicating where predominantly that reporting will come back through. But just as a belt and braces kind of approach, we put a review date in for each of the concerns so that it still sits within the whistleblowing governance from a perspective of ensuring that recommendations are followed through, but not to get into the detail per se of what the working groups are doing and the outcomes of that. So a little bit complex explanation of where we've gone with that, but I'm happy to take any questions in relation to the new format of the report. Hopefully that provides further assurance around the robustness of the approach we're taking, again taking into account the requirement to keep this as to keep it confidential and be proportionate with the amount of information we divulge into the public space.
Thank you, Gareth. That's a really helpful explanation of what you've added into the report. I found that summary table really helpful, and I think and you're right, that's kind of addressed queries that we've had in the past. I recognise that very difficult balance between giving us the information that we say that we want versus being able to protect the confidentiality, and that's of utmost importance, because we, making sure that people feel safe to be able to speak up has to be a top priority. So I think the way that you've explained that is really helpful, but certainly I found that summary table very useful, and I look forward to kind of seeing that rolling on, so we can see how that develops and how those things are closed off. We often talking about closing the loop with these things, so hopefully that will enable us to see how that is happening. Colleagues, I'll open up for questions, comments, observations around our whistleblowing report. Emily.
Thank you, and thanks, Gareth. I guess I'd always ask where there's no concerns raised. Is it because there aren't any concerns, or because people are maybe not aware of the process? I know there's been a lot of improvement in terms of work around raising awareness and things like Speak Up Week, and I know Bert's an excellent whistleblowing champion. I guess just because we've got quite a lot of concern and indeed a risk captured around low numbers of completion of Statman training. I know that training is one of the ways through online modules that we get people aware of the process. So I suppose I'm just highlighting that with that in mind, there's maybe more importance placed on other ways of communicating the standards, just to make sure that we are genuinely capturing everything that might come under the standards. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Emily. What I have been thoughtful about is that we do also have our confidential contact service, and we're not reflecting that in our whistleblowing reports. I'm just thoughtful about maybe that context piece might be helpful for us to include in terms of the numbers that are being reported through that. I suppose I was probably being a little bit purist around what we're required to report under the standards versus what is the wider context of concerns that are raised. So I think it's something we should give a little bit of thought to, but I need to put some context around it so people understand, board members understand the purpose of the confidential contacts. And I suppose one way of putting it is we sometimes talk about concerns being raised through the confidential contacts. A lot of it is a lot of it's issues, if you like, that people are coming forwards, getting advice about, and then getting support with that. So I think it's what's in a word. It's probably quite important. So I suppose when we present that, to say actually what we want to see people, using that service and approaching them. The slight caution I have is that that should be healthy. It's a little bit like adverse events. We want to see people reporting things. We shouldn't jump to conclusion that that means lots of people have got lots of concerns that are a high level of concern. So that's very much our precursor and early resolution space for a number of concerns. Not the only space for early resolution. There's other spaces like working with trade unions and HR as well. So it's a useful prompt, actually, I think, for us to think about how we incorporate that into the report. And I think that might be my next iteration of the report, is to put a summary table of what we've reported through the confidential contacts. And we'll come back with a different layout to the report in the future.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks, Gareth. I would support that. I think that sounds like a really sensible way forward with that. So we look forward to seeing that in the future. Bert, I'll bring you in, please.
Thank you, Chair. I would really just reiterate what Gareth said. what's reflected in the report, of course, are concerns which meet the criteria for the whistleblowing standards and which have been progressed using the standards, but there will be other issues, I think is the word that Gareth raised, which will be brought forward, and of course there are other routes. Gareth spoke about the confidential contacts, but there's also business as usual through line managers and indeed other routes. There is still work to do in relation to raising people's awareness of the standards, I have no doubt of that, and that's something that we must continue to strive towards. But I think including in the report the additional information that we've talked about here would be useful for board members, and I would support Gareth's suggestion that he takes this forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Bert. Gareth, I'll bring you back in.
No, I think Bert's covered the main point. So I was probably just going to come back to his other point, which was around concerns being raised. I think there's the other aspect is that in keeping, I suppose, with the principles of early resolution that we follow through in our workforce policies, the standards are written that way as well, so that the emphasis is on trying to resolve at an early stage. So what I might reflect on is whether we report concerns that may have been raised that are not eligible. That's one aspect. We get things that come through that aren't eligible. Predominantly those are things that are HR related, and the standards are quite clear around that. Haven't had many of them, so I think it's probably just thoughtful about whether that would add value to the report. And I suppose what I was trying to say within the report there, with the one concern we've got, so this about openness and transparency is to say that concerns continue to be managed. So I suppose maybe we need to think about in terms of how we articulate where concerns have been brought forwards and we're not taking them forwards into investigation per se, in agreement with the individual. There is absolute importance to investigating fully where it's agreed with the whistleblower that that's the best course of action. But similarly, it's a lot of resource, and it involves a lot of people's time, which is important. But again, we need to be clear that that's going to achieve the outcome the whistleblower wants as well. So it's a little bit complicated. Each case is very nuanced and different in terms of the circumstances. And I think the importance is we actually have a lot of conversation with the individuals before progressing into the standards. So I think we just need to articulate that in the reports coming forwards, any that we have maybe holding either in open dialogue to manage it over a period of time, or we've had a conversation and we've decided that whistleblowing standards aren't the best route for their concern.
Thanks, Gareth. I think that's a really helpful explanation. Okay, I am not seeing any other hands up or any other questions. I think that was a really helpful discussion, and as Gareth has said, look forward to picking up some more information in the summary, which will help board members get that overall picture. So we are being asked to take moderate assurance from the report in front of us today, and take confidence of the compliance with legislation, policy and board objectives, noting those challenges around the timescales which we've just talked about, and picking up on the complexity that Gareth just referenced. Are members content with that? Okay, super duper, thank you. So that takes us on to item number 11, and this is my one. So this paper is in front of you. I am asking the board to approve that we appoint Jerry to the position of board vice chair from the 1st of April after Anne's term comes to an end. The information is set out in the paper explaining the process, and obviously the fact that we have had approval from the Cabinet Secretary around my recommendation, and it's now just before the board to approve that decision. Lovely, thank you. Jerry, put your hand up. Give me a thumbs up, Jerry. Yeah. Great, just to show that I'm not forcing you into it. Excellent. And then that leads nicely on to the last substantive item, which is covers some changes to our governance committee memberships, specifically the chairs of some committees. Taking into account we've got a number of moves, people leaving their terms coming to an end, and as such we are making some changes to the chairs. I'm sorry, I've stolen your piece, Ruth. I know that you were going to introduce this, but I'll just carry on because I've started. We can see that we are going to hand over the chair of clinical governance to Karen, and Emily is going to take over the chair of audit. There will be more changes coming in the new year. So as I've referenced, I've got some new non-executives who I have appointed. And once I can make the announcement of that public, we can have another look at the distribution of our board members around our various governance committees and the chairing of those. But I'm happy to take any questions or comments, or Ruth, if you wanted to add anything that I didn't cover because I jumped straight in there in my enthusiasm. Nope. Okay. Is everybody happy with those proposals? And I'll bring forward a future paper when the next round comes round. Lovely. Okay. So I'll just pause momentarily before I release you for the rest of your day. Do we have any other competent business that anyone wishes to raise? No, lovely. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We've been very efficient today. The next time we meet as a board is the 28th of January, believe it or not. But we will see each other lots in between at all our various committees. So I hope you have a lovely afternoon and see you all soon.
Thank you.
See you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.